Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I want to talk on the breaking news coming out from the American administration regarding Cuba and Donald Trump's recent remarks on a possible friendly takeover of Cuba. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've come across an article in The Guardian which is entitled Trump suggests US could carry out friendly takeover of Cuba. Now, I've just done a while back, not too long ago, an episode on Cuba and how I think things would unfold. I did say that I think before the end of the year, the Cuban regime would be basically overthrown. However, I mentioned that due to sanctions, the Cuban people have been to hell and back. The Cuban economy is virtually non-existent. The cancellation of oil shipments from Venezuela as a result of the ousting of President Nicolas Maduro has resulted in virtually zero oil going to the Cuban island. And whilst the Americans did mention that they would allow possibly a little bit of oil to trickle into the country regarding on the basis of humanitarian aid, I did I did say that I think Cuba is on its last legs. Whilst the people have endured decades of crippling sanctions and it goes to their resilience, I don't think that a military option is required because Cuba has nothing that it can put forward in terms of military posturing or a military alternative to what the United States is capable of throwing at them. I think this is going to be a feather in the cap of Donald Trump because he'll be seen as the president that finally resolved the issue with Cuba. And this article makes for an really interesting read. However, a lot of it is based on what Trump has said, so it's mere speculation at this point. But let's look at this article and analyze it. Trump suggests US could carry out friendly takeover of Cuba. As tensions between two countries reach new highs, US President says regime is talking with us. Donald Trump has suggested the US could carry out a friendly takeover of Cuba as tensions between Washington and Havana reach a new high after the capture of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. So we know that the oil pipeline to Venezuela, the shipments of oil to Cuba from Venezuela has been reduced to zero. We know that Mexico, Iran, Russia, none of them are now shipping oil to Cuba. So the Cuban oil requirements are woefully not being met at the moment. As he left the White House for a campaigning event in Texas on Friday, Trump said the Cuban government is talking with us. They're in a big deal of trouble. Although he gave no further details, it has been widely reported that US officials had met with Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, the grandson of 94-year-old Raul Castro, on the sidelines of the Caribbean Leaders Summit, CARICOM, as part of negotiations on opening up the island. Trump said on Friday they have no money, they have nothing right now, but they're talking with us and maybe we'll have a friendly takeover of Cuba. I have to admit, I think a friendly takeover of Cuba is the best option for the Cuban people. Dragging them now into a military conflagration with the United States is just going to be, that they already have descended into hell. Going into a military conflagration with the Americans pushes them that much further. And I think it's something they honestly do not deserve. the Cuban people have suffered enough. The president's comments came as relations between the two countries have sunk to one of their lowest points in an often bitter 67-year history. The US has cranked up pressure on Cuba's struggling regime after its successful abduction of Venezuelan president and Cuba ally Nicolas Maduro in January. In advance of an attack on Caracas, US officials warned a promise of cooperation from Maduro's deputy Delcy Rodriguez, now Venezuela's acting president, who was promised to open up the country's sizable reserves to foreign companies. So again, in my Venezuela episode, when I first started the channel, this was the breaking news at that time. While everybody was in awe of what was going on, and they were saying that there's no way a deal was done, and things to that nature, I said at the outset, Delcy Rodriguez has done a deal with the United States. She has sold Nicolas Maduro out and done a deal. And for many, it was something that was unpalatable. It's now here. The article goes on. Pressure from Washington has also led to the departure of the Attorney General, Tarek William Saab, and promoted Venezuela to cut off oil exports to Cuba. The U.S. has imposed an oil blockade on the island, strangling what was left of the island's already parlous economy. Trump said, "I've been hearing about Cuba since I was a little boy, but they're in big trouble." Alluding to the large Cuban exile community in the US, he suggested a takeover of the island could be something good, very positive for them, saying, we have people living here that want to go back to Cuba and they're happy with what is going on. Trump's acquisitive language will provoke worries amongst Cubans that history is repeating itself. US financial domination of the Cuban economy was one of the main drivers of Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. Now again, in this episode that I did on Cuba, I mentioned that Donald Trump looks at Cuba primarily as a business opportunity. I said he's a hotelier. He's from the hospitality industry, and remember, the mafia had extensive real estate, casinos, gambling activity in Cuba. It was their playground. Meyer Lansky was the man in Cuba. Lucky Luciano was well represented. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, when Lucky Luciano was banished from the United States after he had provided assistance to the American GIs landing in Italy, because he negotiated a deal with Cosa Nostra members in Italy on the island of Sicily to help support the Americans in their efforts to unseat Mussolini. He was rewarded by not being put into jail because Dulles was an ardent enemy of Luciano. Dulles wanted to see him put away for life. However, Luciano was spirited out of the country, but he was subsequently, I think, caught just off the coast of Cuba or something like that, if I remember correctly, and was returned to Italy, where he lived out the remaining of his days. So yes, the mafia had an extensive hand in Cuba, and they controlled Cuba and manipulated it like it was their own personal playground. Now you have Donald Trump, who I did say in my last video, viewed this as a business opportunity, pretty much like Gaza. And here's it in the article. Have a look at this article. It's really interesting, and I think the groundwork is being set for a change, not necessarily of the government in Cuba, but a change of the direction in which the government has been heading for the last 67 years. So I think you are going to see a reversal of a lot of what Fidel Castro, along with his brother Raul Castro and Che Guevara, had fought for and implemented in Cuba. I think Cuba is going to be open for business. It's going to be redeveloped. You've got American companies, you've got international companies salivating at the option of going into Cuba and developing it. And I hope, I'm very, very pessimistic about this, but there is a bit of optimism. I hope that some of that good fortune will trickle down to the impoverished people of Cuba. However, you know, I don't hold my breath. So I want to thank you for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.